For this build, you will need some 19mm or 3/4 inch thick pine, some 6mm or 1/4 inch thick MDF or ply, and some 30 by 30mm pine as well. I'll talk more about these later. You'll also need some nails to use as axles, and that is literally it. We'll start with the slide. I'm going to make the slide out of this 30 by 30mm pine, but this isn't a particularly common size, so there's other ways you can do it. You could make it out of 19mm and your slide would just be a bit thinner, or you could even laminate pieces onto the side of this and make your slide out of 3 pieces of wood. You could also find some construction lumber, like this treated pine. Now that would work just fine for a slide. If I planed it down, you can see it's nearly the same dimensions. But I've got this 30 by 30, so that's what I'm going to use. So I've started by arching the top of the slide. Just draw the line and plane to it. I can now stick the templates on with a regular old glue stick. With that template glued on, I can now drill this hole so that a nail can spin freely. It doesn't go all the way through. It goes about 28mm in. We can then saw off this piece, then mark and saw out this cutout. You want these side pieces here to be between 6 and 8mm thick. So I've made that cutout, and I made it rounded for a reason, because this little piece will come in handy later on. With the cuts made to the front of the slide is now finished. So we can apply a wet cloth, give that a bit of time, and it'll peel right off. Have a look at that. The 2 frame parts are pretty simple. Just cut them out and glue them to your standard 19mm or 3/4 timber. The part that's cut out from this block can then be used to make the trigger, but first we'll thin it down a little bit. As for these 2 pieces, they simply glue together. Plane just a tiny bit off, maybe not even 1/2mm. We'll have a look at the side plates. As usual, these can be cut together as one unit. Now you could choose to pin them together, but I've recently found it's a bit quicker just putting some double-sided tape and sticking them together. Now notice, due to the locations of this tape, once I cut this out, those plates will fall apart, but it means that tape won't tear out the wood. Start this slot with a pair of 4mm holes and then saw it the rest of the way. Mark the centre of this hole with a punch so we can drill it later, and then you can remove the paper template. Round off this section of each side plate before you glue it to the frame, because once you glue it to the frame, that'll be much harder to access. When you glue these plates together, line up that edge on a flat surface and line up these 2 parts too. It should be pretty nicely aligned once you do that. There are no parts inside the frame, so you can then also glue on the other side plate. With the frame all glued up, it's a good time to check the fit of the trigger. You want that to slide nice and freely with a tiny bit of clearance. And then we can glue that to the slide. With the trigger all the way forward and the slide positioned as far forward as it should go, can mark the back of the trigger, and maybe the front too, to help me align it properly. Mark a rectangle on the slide so that the trigger can be glued as parallel as possible. So with the slide in the fully forward position, what you can do is mark a line there and there, and that will tell you where you need to drill the hole for the pin that holds the slide in place. Now if you have a drill press, that hole will be nice and precise, but if not, you just mark it from the other side as well and drill the hole from both sides. Whichever method you use, you will need a drilling guide. It's a little hard to see in there, but if I put the drill through there, the top edge of that pin will line up with the top edge of this slot, and that's very important. As for the rotor pin, you want to cut this to a length that is at the same level or just a bit below the slide. The slide can then be pinned on with a nail with a notch cut in it. That notch needs to hold a couple of rubber bands. So we'll put the slide in place. Now the slide's pinned in place. That little notch is facing rearward. It moves freely. There's a little bit of wobble, but not too much. Now if there is too much wobble, you can use a slightly larger pin, and if on the other hand the slide is too tight, you can sand down this flat surface on the frame. The rotor can then be pinned in place, much like the slide. The rotor is pretty simple, just a square of wood with a hole in the middle, rounded off nicely. Now you can use the same wood as the side plates for that, and you want whatever you use for a pin to be able to fit tightly through that hole. So if I mark it there and cut it, it'll be just the right length. To center the rotor, I put a bunch of washers underneath the rotor and then hammered the pin into place. Now those washers will come out and the rotor is nicely centered. Of course the best way to test it is to shoot it. So I've put a little nail in here. I'll double over one of these size 16 rubber bands and hook it on there. That'll spring the slide. I can bias load my size 16 rubber bands. Seems to work well. Sometimes the slide even locks open. This little block in the back of the slide isn't essential, but it's easy enough to add. Now it's pretty hard to work with 2mm thick wood, but that piece that we cut out from inside the slide, we can use that to make those little pieces. Once you've rounded off both ends, you can cut your slide serrations if you want to. I recommend varnishing the inside section of the slide and the rotor before you glue those side plates on, because once they're glued on, that rotor's staying there. When you finally do lock the rotor in place, you may just want to use a minimum of glue, so if you do have to take it off, it's not too difficult. Start contouring the grip. I've roughed it out with a knife and I'll sand it later on. Contouring the grip is probably the most labour intensive part, but it's well worth it. Once that's done, you can give it a thin coat of polyurethane inside and out. To do that, I dilute some varnish so that it's very watery. Use a soft brush and wipe it off. Once you've done that inside out to all the parts, you can add more coats of varnish or a wax finish, whatever you like, so long as you don't paint it colours that'll get you into trouble. You can load either of these rubber band guns with size 12, size 14 or size 16 bands. So for the 12s, you can just load them the normal way, hang on to the slide, stretch them back and turn the rotor back. Once again, as you turn the rotor, the slide will come with it. Just like that. For the 16s, unfortunately I don't have any 14s, you should bias load these, because that way they will have just a little bit more accuracy and range. In fact, they will have quite a lot of accuracy and range if you bias load them like that. Capacity will depend on what materials you use. If we look at the space on either side of the rotor, there's a lot more space on either side of the VP70 rotor, and that's why it can hold about 14 rubber bands as opposed to the VP70's 8. You can actually see a little bit of the rotor axle. That means it's not fully loaded. This one, you can't see the axle anymore. That tells me it's fully loaded and ready to go.